We have been discussing steps from the book When Shovel Breaks of how to help one find their way back to God. We started with the importance of forgiveness, forgiving self, forgiving others. And last week we looked at overcoming disappointment, how disappointment from others enters our lives, endangers our spiritual well-being, even sometimes, let's admit that brethren are well-intended, and yet it can be very disappointing to us. And maybe it's not what we say, but it's how we say it, or when we say it, or maybe there wasn't enough wisdom put in on our part to know what to say, or how to say it, or when to say it. Obviously, we had good motives, but unfortunately, the person became discouraged by whatever we said, and that can happen and has happened a lot, especially in the church. Just one example, very quickly, and then we'll get into step 4 into today's discussion. The truth is important. Please don't misunderstand me. You got to have the truth, okay? You got to be living by the truth. There is no other way, all right? Let's be honest. Let's be forthright with the fact that God has laid out a plan and a way to heaven. And there's only one. And there's no getting around that way. How we share that with other people can determine whether they accept it or not. And that's just one example. And as much as I love the Lord's church, and as much as I believe with all of my heart that the Lord's church is following the truth, I am telling you that I know of examples where people in the Lord's church have ran other people off, not because they were wrong. They were right in what they were saying, but they were very discouraging in how they approached it. And if you hadn't ever known of that to happen, then good for you. But I've known of several occasions where that has happened, where people in the Lord's church felt like they were really doing good. And that's what they wanted to do, and I know that. I don't doubt their motives for a moment. They really wanted to do good. The problem was their approach or their timing or their... I've heard the word nagging, and I think sometimes people can get discouraged when we nag, if that's what you want to call it. Again, the truth is the truth. I'm not saying we ignore the truth, or we minimize the truth, or we leave the truth on the shelf somewhere. What I am saying from last week's discussion, I hope that you realize how easy it is. These people are already unfaithful, okay? They're looking for an excuse, right? So the last thing we need to do is give them one. That's the point from last week's discussion. Step number 3 is overcoming discouragement from others, from outside. They're already struggling. They're already weak. They're already searching for something to give them an excuse, and when you provide that, then I don't think it's going to work on Judgment Day, okay? I'm not saying that, but it sure works well in today's society. Well, I don't go to church because of so-and-so, and because of what they said to me, and they think this, or they think that, or they approached me here or there, and it was just uncalled for. And so I'm blaming it on them. And that could be me or you in that blame. Again, I don't think that's going to hold water before God, okay? I'm not saying that. But it is very heartbreaking for that to happen when we're the cause of it. So now, moving from step 3 to step 4, and they're connected. But today's thought from chapter 41 in the book is overcoming self-disappointment. Now, here's what I kind of like about it's almost like when we talk about forgiveness, self is the hardest thing to forgive. When we're talking about discouragement, it's almost like all the other voices are louder than our own. Meaning, when I get discouraged from outside, that screams louder than being discouraged from inside. But when you haven't given me a reason to be discouraged, when you've acted the way you're supposed to act, now I got to look at myself, right? Now I've got to come internally, and for those that are unfaithful to the Lord, what they've got to admit is that they're not happy with themselves. They're not happy with how they're living. They're not happy with some choices that they're making. They're not happy with some priorities that they've got. And so now you turn. See, as long as I can keep this outwardly, I don't have to reflect inwardly. See, as long as I can point my finger at you and say, well, if you hadn't have done that to me, I'd be faithful. Or if she hadn't have said that, I'd be faithful. Or if they hadn't have, well, as long as I can do that, then I'm good. Not really, but in my mind I am, right? Because I can blame you for my discouragement. But when I can't blame you, then I have to look at myself then and overcoming personal disappointment or discouragement. Let's start with this question. How do you feel when you disappoint yourself? Okay, beat down. Beat down. What else? Let's get a few of them out here. Okay? Down and out. Sorry? Angry. Angry. Whew, that's a good one. Hang on. Okay? Failure. You feel like failure. All right, back here. Say it again. All right. The head is dropped low. The head is hanging. Somewhere here. Regretful. Ooh, there's a good one. Okay. Confidence is gone. Confidence is destroyed. Well, we know what this feels like pretty good, don't we? Man, I'm impressed. You people are very disappointed in yourselves. But anyway, we understand it, don't we? I mean, those of us that's lived a few days, let me ask you this question. How high is the standard to which you're trying to live? You're trying to live like Jesus, who was perfect. I'm glad I'm not, because I'm going to be disappointed a lot. You know what I mean? I feel sorry for you. You probably feel all these feelings that's been mentioned, right? Okay? Standard's pretty high, isn't it? I'm having fun with Shelley on the front. I hope we are all trying to live to that standard, and we are trying to learn, and we are trying to grow. And if that is the case, I don't know how often you stop and think about the standard by which you're trying to live. But if that is the standard, and I do hope it is, I think that's the right one, you're bound to be disappointed sometimes, aren't you? And so am I. Because I don't reach my mark. I don't reach my standard. I never will forget in gym they had the things. I think about them. You've seen something like it. Well, I just went in the clinics. You know, when you go in the clinic and they got them little, I think it's One Stop. They got them little colored things that stick out from the door, you know. Every time I see one of them, there's about 5 or 6 of them there, I think about that thing in the gym we used to jump up and hit and try to knock as many as we could knock, you know, to see who could jump the highest, right? So you jump up and hit those little plastic things, and as many as you could hit, we were measuring our vertical, right? And of course, they were more above what I could hit, right? And so that kept you pushing. I don't know what the standard was. I mean, obviously you're just trying to do as good as you could do within your ability and skill set. But obviously, every time you jump up and hit those things, there was always some higher. And so you'd have to look up and you'd have to say, well, if I'd push a little harder, I might be able to get that next one, right? And then if you didn't get the next one in a day or two, you could very easily get disappointed over something very trivial like basketball, right? In reality of spiritual life, the same, the standard's up there. So there it is. And when you don't meet it, or when I don't meet it, we're bound to have feelings of disappointment, and so we feel beaten down. We feel the pressure of failure. Isn't that kind of odd? We hear all this talk about the pressure to succeed. I'm not sure that failure doesn't have more pressure than success. I think they both come with an element of pressure, because you feel this angst about yourself when you're disappointed in yourself. You drop your head. You feel beaten down. You feel low and out. You feel, I'll use the idea of valueless. You feel like you're not worth anything. Well, let me ask you this question. Can God use disappointment for future benefit?
We have to look at Peter.
Okay?
I mean, could he give up after his betrayal of Jesus?
He certainly should have.
Quit and walk off. He could have done like Jesus killed himself.
Okay? Perfect example. The Apostle Peter. He had every opportunity to take his life as Judas did, right? There's your contrast to disappointment. Should Peter have been disappointed in himself? On more than one occasion, right? I mean, let's talk about the 3 denials in the courtyard. That may be the pinnacle, but let's remember that that's not the first time Peter's got himself in a pickle. Maybe that's the worst time, maybe. But he should have been disappointed with himself several times. Could have been, should have been. I would suggest was disappointed in himself. He had a choice, right? He chose not to take Judas, on the other hand. Should Judas have been disappointed in himself? Absolutely. His conscience ate him up, didn't it? Unfortunately for Judas, his disappointment got to an unhealthy level, and what did he do? He quit. He give up. We know ultimately what he did, but the point is he decided, he let his worthlessness in his own mind drive him to a point of no return. Peter, on the other hand, when the rooster crowed, he was filled with sorrow. He was moved with grief. He was disappointed. Yet, we know the end of the story, right? How God used him. And so can God use disappointment for a future benefit? Did Peter grow from... Let's look at 2 Corinthians 1, verses 7 through 11. Listen to what Paul said. This is the example that Michael Shank uses in his book about Paul understanding discouragement or disappointment. Did everything work out perfectly for Paul? No. Were there, as he would call them, perils, P-E-R-I-L-S, perils? Were there perils in his life? Yes. Difficulties, trials, disappointments, things didn't always go his way. Listen to verse 7. Our hope for you is unshaken, for we know that as you share in our sufferings, you will also share in our comfort. For we do not want you to be unaware, brethren, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. Paul mentions sufferings. He mentions afflictions. He was going from place to place and town to town and house to house and trying to preach the gospel and teach the good news of Jesus. And sometimes people rejected. They wouldn't respond to the message. That's kind of hard sometimes. Paul definitely felt disappointment because he was preaching to hearts that he knew needed to receive the gospel, and yet they refused to allow Jesus into their lives and their souls. And so, no doubt he left many houses disappointed, knowing that there were people who were lost. But then beyond that, he mentions here the affliction in Asia. Not only was he not received, sometimes he was ran out. That'd be very disheartening, wouldn't it? You're trying to help someone. You're trying to tell someone about eternal life and salvation, and they say to you, get away from me. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to talk about this. It's very tough to swallow, isn't it? You know in your heart that they're unfaithful at best and lost at worst, and I hope it's disappointing. Maybe it's not self-disappointment, but maybe you began to think about that, and maybe you began to think, well, what can I do differently? How can I approach that person or maybe someone else? Or reality of it is you may have to shake dust off your feet at some point, or you may have to back up and punt and take a different game plan. But through all of that, there's bound to be some affliction, some disappointment that you experience and have to deal with. He says in the end of verse 8, For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt the sentence of death, verse 9, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raised the dead. Think about verse 9. Let me go back to my question. Can God use disappointment for future benefit? What does that look like? How's that work? I'm sorry? Okay. Following Jesus. Pointing us in that direction. The right direction. Okay? Reminds us, teaches us, helps us to promote persistence, perseverance. In that same vein, the idea of patience. Failure is a good tool for producing patience, isn't it? We're not for a moment promoting the acceptance of failure here, okay? We're not promoting that, okay? What we are promoting is using failure for a future benefit or blessing. What are those blessings? Yes, sir.
When we fail, Rodney, we should have a mindset that Satan won't win, and it should make us strong.
Okay? So, a little bit of reverse psychology here, maybe a little bit, but when we fail, it ought to open our eyes to the power of Satan. When we give in to temptation, or when we sin, because of something that Satan has put in our way and made look very enticing, it ought to remind us of the power of Satan. That ought to then inspire us to be more active in defeating Satan. So there's a good coming out of something that's not good. We're trying to get something positive out of something that can be very negative to the point of causing one to take their own life, right?
In the church, I think God designed it around dependency.
Okay?
We're dependent on one another, and then ultimately we depend upon Him. And if we're not able to be that way, then when we fail, we're trying to look within for the answers when we're the one that failed.
Okay?
And the answer's not here, it's outside. And
Okay.
we depend on God for that. It
Well-
brings us down
Okay?
the right way.
In the right way, it brings us down to shift our dependency outside of ourselves, ultimately. So one benefit from disappointment, or one good or potential future goal that Paul mentions here in 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 9 is this idea of dependency. We are dependent. It's shifting. So easy to become self-dependent, isn't it? And oftentimes that's when we find ourselves disappointed. What do you think? And so like Jeremy says, when we understand the value of one another, ultimately the value of God, we lean on each other, we lean on God. Paul says in verse 9, it is there for us not to rely on ourselves, but to rely on God, who is able to raise the dead, as in a way of saying He's able to do anything He wants to do. If He can raise the dead, He can do anything else, right? You can get so low that you can be dead spiritually. What do you think? God have the power to raise you up from your own ashes? Sure. Spiritually speaking, disappointment can drive us to a low of lows when we fully focus on ourselves, when our soul strength resides in us, then we're bound to be disappointed. Verse 10, He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and He will deliver us. On Him we have set our hope that He will deliver us again. You also must help, Corinthians, by prayer, so that many will give thanks on our behalf for the blessings granted us through the prayers of many. God has delivered us. We are confident that God will deliver us. And what we're asking of you is that you pray for us, you pray for one another, you pray for our persistence, you pray for our perseverance through all of these. And Paul lists them later on in the book of 2 Corinthians about all the different dangers in life that they face. So think about this with me for just a moment. A person who is faithful to God, who is a faithful Christian, who finds themselves overtaken, enwrapped with sin. And maybe just one, right? It's that weakness. It's that weakness that we all have. You have yours, I have mine. God knows what yours is. He knows what mine is. Satan knows it better, right? So a faithful Christian that is consumed, overpowered, tripped up, whatever terminology you want to use, by sin, by that sin, what are their options? Okay? Prayer. All right? What are their options? He gives two in the book, but I'm thinking there's more to discuss here.
I've heard it said that when you're at the bottom, the only way you can look is up.
Okay?
With that thought in mind, when we're disappointed in ourselves, what we've done, we can't, we're the lowest, we don't have help. I mean, we're assigning ourselves to the fact that we can't say anybody else put us there, we put ourselves there.
Okay?
And so you feel the lowest because you let yourself down. But the only way that you can get help sometimes is to look up.
Okay? The option of looking up. Sometimes rock bottom is where I need to be. I don't want to be there. As Jeff had just said, when I put myself there, it is a huge, huge admission that I put myself there. Now, it's one thing for you to put me there. It's another thing when I have to admit that I've put myself there. But when I get there, or when I am there, and sin has got me, I'm on rock bottom. I've got the opportunity to look up. I've got the chance to, as Levo said, obviously in prayer, the avenue by which that can happen. What's some other options? Okay? Separate yourself from what's tempting you. That's a challenge, isn't it? That is an option. The difficulty with that is that we really got to convince ourselves we don't want to do it, right? We gotta really get convicted of that point. Separating ourselves from what's tempting us. Avoiding the trap, if you will. What other options are available? Okay? There is help out there, right? Obviously, Levo started with talking to God. Jeff mentioned talking to somebody else. It's amazing to me that when you become transparent, and we all struggle with that, but when you become transparent, I think what you'll find is you're not the first person to struggle with that. And it may be that somebody else real close to you struggles, has struggled or did struggle or had the challenge at one point in their lives. I mean, folks, there's a lot of wisdom in the church. It's a lot of people with a lot of wisdom that's not been perfect, but has experienced a lot of things, made a lot of decisions, made some bad decisions, dealt with similar temptation. There's nothing new to man, right? We say that all the time. We're not reinventing the wheel. The ways and avenues of temptation may be different, but the temptation itself still works ultimately the same way. But what you might find is when you talk to someone else in confidence that they can really be of help to you. And they may have experienced some of the same struggles, and how did they overcome? What did they do? Talk to somebody else. Very good. What else? What other options do you have? That's the one I'm looking for, because that's the most common. Unfortunately, that's the most common. You quit. You quit. Basically, in his book, he mentions two options. You turn to God or you turn away from God. And that would boil it all down, right? I wanted us to put a little flesh on what that looked like instead of just mentioning those two and moving on. But ultimately, that's the options. You either determine you're going to do better, and I hope that's what we're going to do, and we're going to use some of these things that we've discussed. We're going to look up and talk to God and talk to other people, and we're going to use it as building blocks, and we're going to try to separate ourselves from the things that we're struggling with. And all of those things are an effort to turn to God in one way or the other. The other option, and the one I hope we can avoid, is you quit. You just give up. You just stop. You stop fighting. And by stop fighting, what I mean is you embrace the sin, and it becomes you. It becomes part of your life and who you are and what describes you. And so you resent God, or you reject God, or you turn your back on God because of disappointment, because of failure, because you don't feel like you have any purpose or value. I think as we close this morning, what we need to remember is that God can use tough places to do good things. And you may be in a tough place, or you may have been in a tough place recently, or you may be on the horizon of a tough place in your own life. Don't ever lose sight of the fact that God can use tough places. He did in the life of Peter. He did in the life of Paul. Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 12 about the same Spirit that we're all given to drink of. And it has different functions, but it's all one Spirit. And we understand the value and the privilege of having God in our lives and for us. And when He is for us, who can be against us, Romans 8. And we understand that God cares and that He understands all of our temptations. He understands even our failures. We must realize that life always has purpose. And no matter how low you get, God wants to help bring you back up. And we need to be helping people to see that, not pushing them down further.